They said beauty was a curse for a man in chains. But for Elijah Cole, it was something far more dangerous, an invitation to be desired by the wrong master. When the new heir, Thomas Bellamy, arrived at Rosefield Plantation, he noticed Elijah before he noticed the fields. A single glance turned into a fixation, first fascination, then possession. He dressed Elijah in silk, called him refined, and made him stand where no slave should ever stand, too close to power. But what began as the master's obsession soon became his undoing. Behind Elijah's calm eyes grew something sharper than fear. A plan. Because a man stripped of freedom learns to use whatever weapons he has, even the heart of his captor. And when fire finally swept through Rosefield, the question left burning in the air wasn't who was enslaved, but who was truly free. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. Dawn broke over Rosefield Plantation like a wound splitting open across the sky. The air hung thick and wet, carrying the sweet rot of crushed sugarcane mixed with the sweat of bodies already awake before first light. In the quarters, no one had slept well. Word had spread the night before. The old master was dead, buried 3 days ago in the family plot behind the big house. And now his son was coming home. Elijah Cole stood in the yard with the others, his bare feet planted in red Louisiana dirt. He kept his eyes forward, his posture straight but not defiant. Around him, the other enslaved people shifted and whispered, their voices like leaves rustling before a storm. Children clung to their mothers' skirts. Old men stared at nothing, their faces carved from years of knowing better than to hope. "Quiet!" Jonas Pike's voice cracked across the yard like a whip. The overseer stood on the manor steps, his weathered face twisted in its permanent scowl. Pike was a hard man, built from sun-scorched leather and mean calculation. He surveyed the assembled people with the same expression he might give a fence that needed mending. "Line up proper! New master's coming, and I won't have him think I run a sloppy operation." Elijah watched as people scrambled into straighter rows. Beside him, his friend Marcus muttered under his breath, "New master, same as old master." "Hush," Elijah said quietly. The sun climbed higher. Sweat began to bead on foreheads and necks. A baby started crying somewhere in the back row, quickly silenced by its mother. Elijah kept his breathing steady, his face calm. He had learned long ago that survival meant becoming invisible when needed, showing nothing that could be used against you. The sound of hoofbeats and carriage wheels on gravel made everyone stiffen. The carriage that rounded the drive was fine, polished black lacquer with brass fittings that caught the morning light. 4 horses pulled it, their coats gleaming from careful grooming. When it stopped in front of the manor, a driver in livery jumped down to open the door. Thomas Bellamy stepped out first. He was younger than Elijah expected, maybe 30 years old, with the kind of pale skin that said he'd never worked a day under the sun. His linen suit was spotless white, tailored to show off a trim figure. Dark hair swept back from a handsome face that wore its privilege like a second skin. Thomas paused at the carriage door, adjusting his cuffs with practiced ease. His eyes swept across the assembled people with casual ownership. Behind him came his wife. Margaret Bellamy emerged like a ghost in silk. Her dress was pale blue, her skin paler still. Hair pulled back so tight it seemed to stretch her features into permanent displeasure. She took her husband's offered hand and stepped down, her gaze moving across the enslaved people with the same expression she might give spoiled meat. "Welcome home, Master Bellamy," Pike said, touching his hat brim. "I got everyone assembled like you asked." Thomas barely glanced at the overseer. He was already walking toward the lined-up people, his boots clicking on the porch steps. Margaret followed at a distance, her lips pressed into a thin line. Elijah kept his eyes forward as Thomas moved down the line. He could hear the master's footstep, slow and deliberate, could smell cologne and tobacco and something sweeter, brandy, maybe, from breakfast. The footsteps came closer, then stopped. Elijah felt the weight of attention settle on him like a hand on his shoulder. Heat crawled up the back of his neck. He kept breathing, kept his face neutral, even as every instinct screamed that he'd been noticed in the worst possible way. "You," Thomas said. His voice was smooth, educated, with the lazy confidence of someone who'd never been told no. "Look at me." Elijah raised his eyes, met Thomas Bellamy's gaze directly for the first time. The master's eyes were dark, almost black in the morning light. They moved across Elijah's face with open curiosity, lingering on his features in a way that made Elijah's skin crawl. Thomas tilted his head slightly, like he was examining a painting in a gallery. "What's your name?" Thomas asked. "Elijah Cole, sir." His voice came out steady, years of practice keeping emotion locked away. "Elijah," Thomas repeated, tasting the name. "And what do you do here, Elijah?" "Field work, sir. Cutting cane most." "Cutting cane?" Thomas echoed. He circled slowly, still staring. What a waste. Pike. Who assigned this man to field work? The overseer shifted uncomfortably. "He been in the field since he got here, master. Strong back. Good worker. I can see he's strong." Thomas stopped circling, standing too close now. Elijah could see the fine stitching on his collar, could smell the pomade in his hair. "Can you read, Elijah?" The question landed like a trap. Admitting literacy could mean punishment. Slaves who could read were dangerous. Everyone knew that. But lying to the master's face could be worse. "Yes, sir," Elijah said quietly. "A little. A little." Thomas smiled then, and it was the kind of smile that made Elijah's stomach turn. "Fascinating. And who taught you?" "Taught myself, sir. From old newspapers in the quarters." "Remarkable." Thomas turned to Pike. "I want him in the house. Personal attendant. He'll tend my chambers, help me dress, whatever I need. Starting today." Pike's face went sour. "Master, I got old Samuel already doing—" "Samuel is ancient," Thomas interrupted, waving a hand dismissively. "Put him somewhere else. I want this one." He looked back at Elijah, and there was something hungry in that look, something that made Elijah want to step backward even though he knew better than to move. "You'll serve me well, won't you, Elijah?" "Yes, sir," Elijah said. The words tasted like ash. Margaret's voice cut across the yard, sharp and cold. "Thomas, is this really necessary?" "We have perfectly adequate house staff already." "I know quality when I see it, my dear," Thomas said, without looking at his wife. "This one will do nicely." That night, Elijah carried his few possessions, a spare shirt, a wooden comb, a small Bible he'd traded for years ago, into the big house through the kitchen entrance. The house slaves watched him with a mixture of pity and suspicion. No one spoke to him directly. His new quarters were barely larger than a closet, tucked beside the master's chambers on the second floor. A narrow bed, a washstand, a single window that looked out over the fields. Better than the quarters in some ways, cleaner, private. Worse in others that Elijah didn't want to think about. He was arranging his things when he heard a soft knock. Old Samuel stood in the doorway, his gray head bent, eyes tired in their wrinkled sockets. "Came to show you where things are kept," Samuel said quietly. "Master's clothes in the wardrobe, shaving kit on the bureau. Ring the bell if he needs anything, day or night." "I appreciate it," Elijah said. Samuel was quiet for a long moment, staring at the floor. When he spoke again, his voice was barely a whisper. "I seen masters come and go in this house, seen all kinds of wickedness." He lifted his eyes to meet Elijah's. "Better to face the whip than the master's eyes, son. You remember that." Before Elijah could respond, Samuel shuffled away, leaving him alone in the small room. Elijah stood at the window, looking out over the cane fields. The sun was setting, painting everything in shades of red and gold. The cane swayed in the evening breeze, endless rows stretching toward a horizon he'd never be allowed to reach. Somewhere out there, people were finishing their work, heading back to the quarters, to whatever small comforts they could find in the dark. He pressed his palm against the glass. It was still warm from the day's heat. The next morning arrived with pale light through thin curtains. Elijah had barely slept. The narrow bed felt too soft after years on a corn-husk mattress in the quarters. Every sound in the big house seemed amplified. Creaking floorboards, distant voices, the ticking of a clock somewhere down the hall. A bell rang in Thomas's chambers, sharp, insistent. Elijah rose, splashed water on his face from the washstand, and smoothed down his shirt. He'd been given house clothes, plain but clean, better than field wear. The fabric felt strange against his skin, like wearing someone else's life. He knocked once on the master's door. "Enter!" came Thomas's voice. The chamber was large, dominated by a four-poster bed with heavy curtains pulled back. Morning sunlight slanted through tall windows, illuminating furniture that probably cost more than Elijah's entire family would earn in their lifetimes. Thomas stood by the wardrobe in his nightshirt, hair tousled from sleep. "Good morning, Elijah," Thomas said, turning with a smile that seemed too warm for the early hour. "Help me dress, will you? I have business in town after breakfast." "Yes, sir." Elijah moved to the wardrobe, opening it to reveal rows of fine clothes. Coats, vests, shirts in various colors. "Which would you prefer?" "The gray coat, white shirt, the burgundy vest." Thomas stretched, seemingly unconcerned by his state of undress. "Tell me, Elijah, did you sleep well? The room adequate?" "Yes, sir. Thank you." Elijah laid out the clothes on the bed, then approached with the shirt. Thomas held up his arms like a child being dressed, and Elijah slipped the garment over his head and shoulders. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, buttoning the collar, smoothing the fabric. He'd watched his mother dress his younger siblings this way years ago, before they were sold. Thomas turned to face the full-length mirror, and Elijah stood behind him, adjusting the shirt's fit. In the reflection, he could see Thomas watching him rather than his own appearance. Those dark eyes tracked Elijah's movements with an attention that made his skin prickle. "You have fine features, Elijah," Thomas said suddenly. "Quite striking, really. Strong jawline, good bone structure." He tilted his head, still watching Elijah in the mirror. "Has anyone ever told you that?" Elijah kept his face neutral. "No, sir." "Well, they should have." Thomas reached for the vest Elijah held out. "Beauty should be acknowledged, don't you think? Even when it appears in unexpected places." Movement near the door made Elijah glance up. Margaret Bellamy stood in the doorway, already dressed in a morning gown of pale green. Her face was composed, but her eyes moved between her husband and Elijah with something sharp and watchful. "Thomas," she said coolly, "breakfast will be ready soon." "Thank you, my dear." Thomas didn't look at her, still focused on his reflection, and on Elijah behind him. "I'll be down shortly. Elijah is proving quite helpful already." Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line. She lingered in the doorway for another moment, then turned and left without another word. Her footsteps echoed down the hallway, quick and angry. Thomas seemed not to notice. "The coat now, Elijah." The morning passed in a blur of tasks. Elijah served breakfast in the dining room, standing silent against the wall while Thomas and Margaret ate in tense quiet. He cleared plates, brought fresh coffee, tried to become invisible the way he'd learned in the fields, present, but not really seen, except Thomas kept seeing him. After breakfast, Elijah cleaned boots in the hallway outside Thomas's study. The master kept calling him in for small things, to retrieve a book from a high shelf, to open a window, to simply stand nearby while Thomas worked through correspondence. Each time, Thomas would find some excuse to keep him there a little longer. "Can you read this handwriting?" Thomas asked at one point, holding out a letter. My cousin's penmanship is atrocious. Elijah leaned in, aware of Thomas's shoulder nearly touching his. It says, the shipment will arrive Tuesday next, pending favorable weather. Excellent. Thomas smiled up at him. You see? Already invaluable. I knew quality when I saw it. By afternoon, the whispers had started. Elijah could hear them as he moved through the house, servants speaking in low voices that went silent when he passed. In the kitchen, the cook gave him a look that was half pity, half warning. The housemaid who'd worked there for years wouldn't meet his eyes. Dinner was a formal affair. Thomas had guests, neighbors from nearby plantations, come to pay respects to the new master. Elijah served wine and carved meat, moving through the dining room like a ghost. He felt their eyes on him, heard the slight pause in conversation when he came near. After the guests left, Thomas called him to the parlor. Fetch the violin from the music room, Thomas said, settling into a leather chair with a glass of bourbon. I want music. The violin was old, well-crafted, probably imported. Elijah had taught himself to play years ago, sneaking into the old master's music room when the house was empty. It had been dangerous then. Now it felt worse. He drew the bow across the strings, playing a simple melody he remembered from childhood. Thomas watched from his chair, drinking slowly, his eyes never leaving Elijah's face. The bourbon level in the glass went down. Another glass appeared, then another. Beautiful, Thomas murmured. Both the music and the musician. Elijah kept playing. Thunder rolled across the sky as evening darkened into night. Elijah was putting away the violin when the first drops hit the windows. Within minutes, the storm was raging, wind howling, rain lashing the glass, lightning turning the world white and terrible. Thomas stood at the window, swaying slightly. The bourbon had done its work. You should stay here tonight, he said. His words were careful, too precise. The storm. Dangerous to cross the grounds. I'm just down the hall, sir, Elijah said quietly. Still, Thomas turned from the window. I insist, for safety. The word hung in the air like smoke. Elijah felt his heart beating too fast, felt the familiar cold settling into his bones, the same feeling he'd had on the auction block, when men examined him like livestock. The same helplessness. Yes, sir, he heard himself say. The door closed. The lock turned with a soft click. Rain hammered the windows. Lightning flashed, turning everything stark and shadowless for brief, terrible moments. Thunder followed, shaking the house to its foundations. Elijah stood very still, breathing, enduring. Morning came gray and heavy. The storm had passed, but left everything damp and sullen. When Elijah finally emerged from Thomas's chambers, the hallway was empty. He walked on legs that felt distant from his body, moved through air that seemed too thick to breathe. In the kitchen, the servants fell silent when he entered. They looked away, busying themselves with pots and dishes. Even the cook, usually kind, found something urgent to attend to at the far counter. Elijah collected the boot polish and brushes without a word, carried them back upstairs. Thomas was still asleep, sprawled across the bed. Bourbon bottles stood on the side table like sentries. Elijah gathered the boots from where they'd been carelessly dropped and took them to the hallway. He sat on a small stool, methodical in his movements. Brush, polish, buff. The leather gleamed under his hands. Outside the window, clouds still hung low and threatening. Footsteps approached. Thomas appeared, dressed now in a casual shirt and trousers. He looked fresh, rested, as if the storm had never happened. Ah, there you are, Thomas said pleasantly. Working already. Excellent. Lightning flashed suddenly, brilliant white against the gray morning. Thunder followed seconds later, a distant rumble. Thomas moved behind Elijah, watching him work. His hand settled on Elijah's shoulder, heavy, possessive. It rested there as seconds stretched into something longer, something that felt like hours. His fingers pressed slightly, as if testing the muscle beneath. Elijah kept polishing. Brush, polish, buff. His face showed nothing. In the window's reflection he could see himself. Amber skin, calm expression, steady hands. No anger, no fear, no hope. Only endurance. The reflection stared back at him, empty as glass. 2 days had passed since the storm. 2 days of careful silence, of avoiding eyes, of moving through the house like a shadow. Elijah had learned the rhythms of Rosefield quickly. When to appear, when to vanish, when to speak and when to hold his tongue. But some things couldn't be hidden. Breakfast was served at 8 o'clock sharp. The dining room glowed with morning light, filtered through lace curtains that softened everything to pale gold. Elijah stood against the wall near the sideboard, hands clasped behind his back, waiting to be needed. Thomas sat at the head of the table, reading a newspaper. Margaret sat to his right, her posture perfect, her face composed. She wore blue today, a morning dress with delicate buttons running up to her throat. Her hair was pulled back severely, making her face look sharp and angular. "More coffee," Thomas said without looking up. Elijah moved forward smoothly, lifting the silver pot from the sideboard. He poured carefully, aware of Margaret's eyes tracking his movements. The coffee steamed in Thomas's cup, dark and bitter-smelling. "Thank you, Elijah." Thomas glanced up, meeting his eyes for just a moment. A small smile touched his lips before he returned to the newspaper. Margaret's teacup rattled against its saucer. Elijah stepped back to his position. Margaret reached for the teapot with hands that weren't quite steady. Tea splashed onto the white tablecloth as she poured, spreading in a brown stain across the linen. She set the pot down harder than necessary. "Clumsy of me," she said, her voice tight. Thomas didn't look up from his paper. "Ring for the maid to bring a fresh cloth." "That won't be necessary." Margaret dabbed at the stain with her napkin, making it worse. Her jaw was clenched so hard Elijah could see the muscle jumping beneath her skin. "I can manage." She looked up suddenly, catching Elijah watching. Her eyes were cold and bright. "You there? Fetch a fresh cloth from the kitchen, quickly." "Actually," Thomas said, folding his newspaper with deliberate care, "I need Elijah to attend to some correspondence in my study after breakfast. Send one of the other servants for the cloth." Margaret's hand stilled on the napkin. "Surely your correspondence can wait." "The dining room requires immediate attention." "The dining room has several servants available." Thomas picked up his coffee cup, sipping calmly. "Elijah's duties are with me directly. That's why I brought him into the house." "How fortunate for him," Margaret said. Each word was clipped, precise. "To be so singularly valued." "Indeed." Thomas seemed oblivious to the ice in her voice. "Quality should be recognized. I learned that from Father. Surround yourself with excellence, even in servants." Elijah kept his face blank, his breathing even. He could feel the tension crackling between them like the lightning from 2 nights before. Margaret's knuckles had gone white where she gripped her napkin. "Ring for Clara," Thomas said to Elijah. "Tell her we need a fresh cloth." "Yes, sir." Elijah moved to pull the bell cord near the doorway. Behind him, he heard Margaret's chair scrape back sharply. "I have letters to write," she announced, "if you'll excuse me." "Of course, my dear." Thomas had already returned to his newspaper. Margaret swept from the room, her skirts rustling like dry leaves. She didn't look at Elijah as she passed, but he felt the heat of her anger like a physical force. By afternoon, the whispers had spread beyond the house. Elijah was carrying clean linens upstairs when he passed an open window overlooking the side yard. Below, near the tool shed, he could see Jonas Pike talking to 2 field hands. The overseer's voice drifted up, loud enough to catch. "Soft hands and pretty face." Jonas spat tobacco juice into the dirt. Master's got peculiar tastes, if you ask me. Ain't natural, the way he— One of the field hands noticed Elijah in the window and elbowed Jonas. The overseer looked up, grinned, and touched his hat in mock salute. His teeth were brown with tobacco, his smile mean. Elijah moved away from the window. That evening, he was straightening the parlor when Margaret entered. He'd thought she was upstairs. The house had been quiet for the past hour. But suddenly, she was there, closing the door behind her with a soft click. Elijah straightened, holding a stack of books he'd been organizing. "Ma'am." Margaret stood with her back to the door. In the lamplight, her face looked drawn, older than her years. Dark circles shadowed her eyes. "You've been here 3 days," she said quietly. "Yes, ma'am. 3 days, and already you've wormed your way into my husband's confidence." She moved closer, her evening dress whispering across the carpet. "Already he defends you, prioritizes you, keeps you close." Elijah set the books down carefully. "I only serve as I'm ordered to serve, ma'am." "Don't!" Her voice went sharp. "Don't pretend you don't understand what's happening. I see how you move around him, how you answer him with that quiet voice, those calm eyes. You think you're clever. No, ma'am. I think I'm a slave doing what he's told." Margaret's hand flew up before he could react. The slap cracked across his face, snapping his head to the side. His cheek blazed with heat. "You are a snake," she hissed. "Brought into my home, corrupting my husband, making me a laughingstock in my own house." Elijah touched his cheek slowly, kept his voice level. "I serve who I am ordered to serve. Nothing more." "Liar." Margaret raised her hand again. The door opened. Thomas stood in the doorway, still dressed for dinner. His eyes went from Margaret's raised hand to Elijah's reddening cheek. His expression darkened. "Margaret, what is happening here?" Margaret lowered her hand, but her chin stayed up. This servant was insolent. I was correcting him. Insolent. Thomas stepped into the room. "What did he say?" "He—" Margaret's confidence wavered slightly. "He spoke disrespectfully. About our household." Thomas looked at Elijah. "Is this true?" "I told Mrs. Bellamy I serve who I'm ordered to serve," Elijah said quietly. "Nothing more." "That's all?" "Yes, sir." Thomas turned back to his wife. His voice was very cold. "You struck him for stating a simple truth? Thomas, you don't understand." "I understand that you are allowing jealousy to cloud your judgment." Thomas moved to stand between them. "Elijah is my personal servant. He answers to me, not to you. If you have concerns about his conduct, you bring them to me. You do not take matters into your own hands." Margaret's face went white, then red. "Jealousy? You think I'm jealous of this? I think you're making a scene in front of the servants." Thomas glanced toward the doorway, where 2 maids had appeared, drawn by the raised voices. They quickly looked away, pretending to busy themselves in the hallway. Margaret saw them too. Humiliation flooded her features. "You defend him? In front of them?" "I defend good order in my household." Thomas's voice was firm. "Now, if you'll excuse us, I need Elijah to help me prepare for tomorrow's business." For a moment, Margaret stood frozen. Her breath came quick and shallow. Then she gathered her skirts and swept toward the door, pushing past the maids without a word. Her footsteps echoed up the stairs, sharp and angry. Thomas waited until the sound faded. "Are you hurt?" "No, sir." Elijah's cheek still stung, but he kept his expression neutral. "Good." Thomas adjusted his cufflinks, a gesture that seemed to settle him. "My wife is adjusting to the household. She'll settle in time. Pay her outburst no mind." "Yes, sir." "Come. I need those letters addressed before morning." Elijah followed Thomas to the study. As they walked, he felt something shift inside him, a small, terrible understanding. Thomas would defend him, had defended him publicly, at the cost of his wife's dignity. The power balance was changing. and Elijah wasn't sure if that made him safer or more endangered than before. Night fell heavy and warm. Elijah finished his duties near 10 o'clock, and finally made his way toward his small room down the hall from Thomas's chambers. The house had settled into sleep. Servants in their quarters, the masters in theirs. He walked quietly, his footsteps soft on the carpet runner. As he passed near the veranda doors, he heard voices outside. Low, urgent. Elijah stopped, moved closer to the glass. The veranda was dark except for a single candle, flickering in the night breeze. Margaret stood near the railing, still dressed in her evening gown. Jonas Pike stood with her, his hat in his hands, his posture respectful, but his face eager. Their words drifted through the cracked door. "I can't continue this way," Margaret was saying. Her voice shook. "I won't be humiliated in my own home." "No, ma'am, that ain't right." Jonas shifted his weight. "Man should know his place. All men. If I can't have his respect," Margaret said softly, "I'll have my revenge." The candle flame wavered, casting strange shadows across her face. Jonas nodded slowly, understanding passing between them without words. Elijah stood very still in the darkness, watching, learning. The candle flickered as he passed, unseen, and disappeared into the shadows of the hallway. The morning sun cut through the bedroom window in sharp golden lines. Elijah was folding Thomas's nightclothes when his master entered from the dressing room, carrying something draped over his arm. "Put those down," Thomas said. "Come here." Elijah set the clothes aside and approached. Thomas held up what he'd been carrying, a shirt of fine white linen, crisp and new. Beside it, dark trousers made of quality wool, a vest, even a proper coat. "These are for you," Thomas said. Elijah stared at the clothes. They weren't cast-offs. They weren't even the simple cotton that house servants wore. These were gentlemen's clothes, real clothes. "Sir, you represent me now." Thomas laid the garments across a chair. "When people see you, they see my household, my standards. I won't have you dressed in rags like some field hand." Thank you, sir." "Don't thank me. Just wear them properly." Thomas gestured toward the dressing screen. "Change now. I want to see if the tailor got the measurements right." Elijah moved behind the screen, his hands shaking slightly as he unbuttoned his rough cotton shirt. The new linen felt impossibly soft against his skin. The trousers fit perfectly, the vest buttoned smooth across his chest. When he stepped out, Thomas was watching him with an expression Elijah couldn't quite read. "Perfect." Thomas circled him slowly. "Yes, much better. You look like a proper servant now." Through the window, Elijah could see some of the other slaves working in the garden below. Old Samuel was among them, pulling weeds from the flower beds, work he'd been reassigned to after losing his position in the house. As Elijah stood there in his new clothes, Samuel looked up. Their eyes met for just a moment. Then the old man looked away, his face carefully blank. But Elijah had seen the horror there, the pity. The changes came quickly after that. At dinner that evening, Thomas had Clara bring Elijah a plate from the kitchen. Not scraps, but actual portions of food. Roasted chicken, fresh bread, vegetables seasoned with butter and herbs, things Elijah hadn't tasted since before he was sold to Rosefield. "You can't work properly on an empty stomach," Thomas said, when he noticed the other servants staring. "He'll eat properly from now on." Margaret sat at the far end of the table, her face like carved ice. She hadn't touched her own food. Later, Thomas showed Elijah the small library off the parlor, shelves lined with leather-bound books that smelled of tobacco and age. "You can read, can't you?" Thomas asked. "Yes, sir." Elijah's mother had taught him, back when he was young, before she was sold away. "Good. You may read from my collection when your duties are finished for the day." Thomas pulled down a volume of Shakespeare. "Educate yourself. I prefer intelligent conversation to empty-headed silence." Elijah took the book carefully. Its weight felt dangerous in his hands. Slaves caught reading could be whipped, could lose fingers, but here was Thomas, offering it freely. "Thank you, sir." "Just return them to their proper places." Thomas was already moving toward the door. "And Elijah? Don't let anyone see you taking liberties. The others wouldn't understand." By the end of the first week, Elijah's new position had created a silent storm through the household. The field hands wouldn't look at him during their brief encounters. The house servants spoke to him only when necessary, their voices careful and cold. Even Sarah, the young kitchen maid who'd always been kind, kept her distance at first, until one evening when she found him reading by lamplight in his small room. "Mr. Cole." Her voice was barely a whisper through the cracked door. Elijah looked up from his book. "Sarah, come in." She slipped inside, glancing nervously down the hall. She was small-framed and quick-eyed, maybe 20 years old. "I shouldn't be here, but I had to. I wanted to see if you were all right." "I'm fine." "Are you?" Sarah moved closer, her voice dropping even lower. "Everyone's talking. They're saying the masters, that you and he—" "Let them talk." "Elijah." Sarah sat on the edge of his narrow bed. "This ain't safe. Whatever he's doing, giving you clothes and books and special treatment, it's going to end badly. It always does." Elijah closed the book slowly, looked at her directly. "What if it doesn't have to?" "What do you mean?" "What if I could use this?" He gestured around the room. "His favor, his trust. What if I could turn it into something real?" Sarah's eyes widened. "You're talking about escape. I'm talking about freedom." Elijah kept his voice steady. "There's a preacher who comes on Sundays. Old man with white hair. I've seen him talking to the servants. Reverend Hayes. Does he go north?" Sarah hesitated, then nodded. "Sometimes. He travels between parishes. Some say he's carried letters before, for people trying to— Could you introduce me to him?" "Elijah, if you're caught—" "I won't be caught." He leaned forward. "Thomas trusts me now. He's given me privileges. I can write letters in my room without suspicion. If Reverend Hayes could carry them north, to abolitionists, to people who might help—" Sarah twisted her hands in her apron. "It's dangerous. Everything is dangerous." Elijah's voice was soft but firm. "But this might be our only chance. Not just mine. All of us." She looked at him for a long moment. Then, slowly, she nodded. "I'll talk to him. But you be careful. The master's favor is a blade that cuts both ways." After she left, Elijah sat in the silence of his room, the weight of possibility settling over him like a physical thing. Meanwhile, in the main house, Margaret paced her bedroom floor. She'd stopped sleeping in the same room as Thomas 3 nights ago, claiming headaches. Really, she couldn't bear to share space with him anymore. Couldn't bear the way he spoke Elijah's name at dinner. Couldn't bear the knowing looks from the servants. When Jonas knocked softly at her door, she opened it quickly. "Ma'am," the overseer twisted his hat in his hands, "begging your pardon for the late hour." "What is it?" "It's about the master." Jonas glanced down the hall. People in town are starting to talk. The merchants, the other planters. They're saying Mr. Bellamy's gotten peculiar, that he keeps one of his slaves dressed like gentry, that he favors him in unnatural ways. Margaret's jaw tightened. What are they saying exactly? That he's lost his mind, that his household has no proper order. Jonas leaned closer. If it keeps up, they might stop doing business with him, might start treating him like he's what? Like he's shameful, ma'am? Margaret turned away, her hands trembling. The humiliation was spreading beyond their home now. Soon everyone would know. Soon her marriage would be nothing but a joke whispered at dinner parties. "Thank you, Jonas," she said quietly. "You may go." After he left, she stood at her window, staring out at the dark grounds. Somewhere in the house below, Elijah was probably sleeping in comfort while she burned with rage. "If I can't have respect," she thought, "I'll have revenge." The words felt like a promise, like a decision made. That night, very late, Elijah sat at the small desk in his room. A candle burned beside him, casting wavering shadows on the walls. He had paper. Thomas had given him access to the study supplies. He had ink. He had words. He dipped the pen carefully and began to write. To anyone who still believes a man can own another, his hand shook slightly. The ink made soft scratching sounds against the paper. Outside, an owl called through the darkness. I write this from a plantation in Louisiana, where I am called property, where I am given clothes and books and kindness, and still I am not free, where my body is owned and my soul is bargained for by a man who calls it favor. The words came slowly at first, then faster. Everything he couldn't say aloud, he poured onto the page, the truth of his captivity, the trap of Thomas's obsession, the desperate hope that someone, somewhere, might read these words and understand. If you believe in freedom, help us. Help all of us who cannot help ourselves. He was signing his name when he heard a soft knock at his door. Sarah. Elijah looked up, the pen still in his hand, the letter still damp with ink. Sunday morning arrived with church bells ringing across the fields. The sound drifted over the cane rows and through the quarters, calling everyone to the manor's small chapel. Margaret stood on the front steps in a pale yellow dress, her hair perfectly arranged beneath a lace bonnet. She smiled, carefully, gracefully, as carriages rolled up the long drive. The Hawthorns arrived first. Mr. Hawthorne owned the plantation 3 miles east, and his wife was known for her sharp tongue and sharper memory. Margaret greeted them warmly. "Eleanor, how lovely to see you." Margaret took Mrs. Hawthorne's gloved hand. "You look positively radiant." "As do you, dear." Mrs. Hawthorne's eyes swept over the manor's facade. "Though I must say, you seem tired. Is everything well?" Margaret's smile didn't waver. "Oh, you know how it is. Thomas has been preoccupied with estate matters. It weighs on both of us. Estate matters?" Mrs. Hawthorne's interest sharpened. "Nothing serious, I hope? Nothing we can't manage." Margaret lowered her voice just slightly. "Though between us, I do worry about him. He's been working himself to exhaustion, barely sleeps. I fear the burden of inheritance has affected his judgment." More carriages arrived. The Simmons family, the Caldwells, the Prices, all wealthy planters, all hungry for gossip, dressed up as concern. Margaret greeted each one with the same delicate worry painted across her features. Inside the chapel, Thomas sat in the front pew, hollow-eyed and drawn. He'd been drinking since breakfast. Margaret could smell the bourbon on him from across the room. Elijah stood in the corner reserved for house servants, his new linen clothes marking him as different from the field hands crowded in the back. Reverend Hayes began his sermon. Something about mercy and grace. Margaret barely listened. She was watching Mrs. Hawthorne whisper to Mrs. Caldwell, watching the sidelong glances at Thomas, at Elijah. After the service, the guests gathered on the lawn for refreshments. Margaret moved through the crowd like a dancer, her movements practiced and precise. "I do hope Thomas isn't falling ill," Mrs. Caldwell said, as Margaret poured her tea. "He seemed rather distant during the sermon. He's been under such strain." Margaret's voice carried just the right note of wifely concern. "Taking over the plantation, managing the household, and he's become so particular about certain things. Obsessive, even." "Obsessive?" Mrs. Price leaned in. "How do you mean?" Margaret hesitated, as if reluctant to speak. "Well, you may have noticed his new personal attendant, the one in the fine clothes, the handsome one?" Mrs. Hawthorne's eyebrow arched. "Yes, rather unusual to dress a slave so well. Thomas insists on it." Margaret's voice dropped to a pained whisper. "He keeps the boy close at all times. Won't let anyone else attend to him. He's even given him access to the library, to his private rooms. He speaks of him constantly. The silence that followed was heavy with understanding. Margaret, dear. Mrs. Hawthorne touched her arm. That's concerning. I know. Margaret dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. I've tried to reason with him, but he won't listen. He says I'm jealous. Jealous. Of a slave. An unnatural affection, Mrs. Price murmured. I didn't want to say it so plainly, but Margaret let the sentence trail off. Let them fill in the rest themselves. The gossip would spread from here like fire through dry grass. She knew these women. By tomorrow, every plantation within 20 miles would be whispering about Thomas Bellamy and his obsession with his beautiful slave. Inside the manor, Thomas paced his study with a glass of bourbon in one hand. He'd heard the whispers, seen the looks. His hands shook as he poured another drink. Elijah! His voice was sharp. Where is Elijah? Clara appeared in the doorway. He's in the library, sir. Tell him to come here, now. When Elijah entered, Thomas locked the door behind him. You're not to leave the house anymore, Thomas said. His words were slightly slurred. Not for any reason. Sir? They're talking about us, about you. Thomas drained his glass. They don't understand. They see corruption where there's only appreciation, recognition of worth. Elijah stood very still. What did they say? It doesn't matter what they said. Thomas's voice rose. I won't have them poisoning your mind against me. You'll stay inside, under my protection, where no one can hurt you. For how long? As long as necessary. Thomas moved closer. His breath smelled of alcohol and desperation. You're grateful, aren't you? For everything I've given you? Elijah watched Thomas's face. The need written there. The craving for approval. He'd seen this pattern before. Thomas spiraling, seeking comfort, demanding reassurance. Yes, sir, Elijah said quietly. I'm grateful. Thomas's shoulders relaxed slightly. Good. That's good. He reached out, his hand hovering near Elijah's shoulder but not quite touching. You understand me, don't you? You're the only one who does. I understand. Then you'll stay close. You'll let me protect you. Elijah nodded. Inside, his mind was working, calculating. Thomas was unraveling. His paranoia was growing. And paranoid men were dangerous, but also predictable, also controllable. Whatever you think is best, Elijah said, his voice gentle. Thomas smiled then, relieved. Yes, that's right. I know what's best. That evening, Jonas found Margaret in the garden, cutting roses with quick, angry movements. Ma'am, he approached carefully. A word, if I may? Margaret didn't look up. What is it? This situation with the master and the boy. It's getting worse. The field hands are losing respect. The other planters are talking. Something needs to be done. What do you suggest? Her voice was cold. Jonas glanced around to make sure they were alone. Let me handle the boy. We can make it look like punishment for theft, or insolence, or any number of things. A proper whipping, public and severe. It would remind everyone of the natural order, would show the master that his preferences can't override plantation discipline. Margaret's hands stilled on the roses. Thomas would never allow it. Then we don't tell him until it's done. Jonas's voice was low and urgent. By the time he finds out, it'll be too late to stop. And once the boy is properly put in his place, things can return to normal. Margaret turned to face him. Her eyes were bright with something that might have been hope or might have been cruelty. Do it, she said, but make sure no one traces it back to me. Jonas nodded. Yes, ma'am. He left her there among the roses, their red petals scattered on the ground like drops of blood. Sarah had been in the hallway outside the garden door, carrying fresh linens to the upstairs rooms. She'd heard every word. Her hands trembled as she clutched the sheets tighter. She waited until Jonas was gone, until Margaret had gone back inside. Then she ran. She found Elijah in his room, reading by lamplight. He looked up when she burst through the door. "Sarah, what's wrong?" "They're going to hurt you." The words tumbled out in a rush. "Margaret and Jonas. They're planning to have you whipped. They want to make it public, make it look like punishment for some crime you didn't commit." Elijah closed his book slowly. "When?" "Soon. Maybe tomorrow. I don't know exactly." Sarah grabbed his arm. "You have to run. Tonight. Before they—" "I can't run." "What?" Elijah stood, moving to the window. Outside, darkness had fallen over the grounds. The fires from the quarters glowed in the distance like small red eyes. "If I run, they'll hunt me down. Dogs, guns, the whole parish searching." His voice was calm, almost detached. "And even if I made it north, everyone I leave behind would suffer for it. Thomas would take his rage out on the others." "Then what are you going to do?" Elijah didn't answer right away. He stared out at the darkness, his reflection ghostly in the glass. "Thank you for the warning," he said finally. "But I'm not running." "Elijah, go back to your duties before someone notices you're gone." Sarah hesitated, then reluctantly left. When she was gone, Elijah knelt by the small fireplace in his room. The embers glowed orange and gold, casting dancing shadows across the walls. He thought about Thomas's paranoia, Margaret's hatred, Jonas's violence, all of them circling like wolves, each one thinking they held power over him. They didn't understand yet, didn't see what he'd learned in these weeks of silk chains and false kindness. Freedom wasn't something given, it was something taken, and the cost was always higher than anyone wanted to pay. "If they think I'm their pawn," Elijah whispered to the flames, "they haven't seen what freedom costs." The fire reflected in his eyes, twin points of light in the darkness. 2 nights later, rain came down in sheets. The manor settled into its evening rhythm slowly, reluctantly. Candles flickered in the windows. The sound of water drumming against the roof filled every room with a steady, hypnotic pulse. Elijah moved through Thomas's chambers with practiced precision. He poured bourbon from the crystal decanter, measuring exactly 2 fingers as Thomas preferred. The amber liquid caught the lamplight, glowing warm against the glass. Thomas sat slumped in his chair, staring at nothing. He'd been drinking since afternoon, his eyes red-rimmed and distant. When Elijah set the glass beside him, Thomas didn't acknowledge it, didn't look up. "Will you need anything else, sir?" Elijah asked. "No." Thomas's voice was flat. "Leave me." Elijah left without another word. The pantry was dark except for a single candle Jonas had brought with him. He moved quickly, his calloused fingers surprisingly deft. As he uncorked the bourbon decanter Thomas kept on the sideboard for late-night drinks. The powder was white and fine, nearly invisible in the amber liquid. Jonas had bought it from a trader who asked no questions, just enough to make a man sick, to make his stomach turn and his head spin. Not enough to kill, that would raise too many questions, but enough to make it believable when they accused the slave of poisoning. Jonas corked the decanter and slipped back into the shadows. The first part was done. Now for the second. He'd already planted the matching bottle in Elijah's room that afternoon, while the house servants were at their duties, hidden it under the loose floorboard beneath the bed. Margaret would know exactly where to look. Margaret waited until the house grew quiet. She moved through the hallways with her skirts rustling softly against the floorboards. The rain covered any sound her footsteps might make. When she reached Elijah's door, she didn't knock. She simply opened it and walked inside. Elijah was sitting on the edge of his bed, still dressed. He looked up sharply when she entered. "Mrs. Bellamy." He stood immediately. "Is something wrong?" "I'm conducting an inspection." Her voice was cold and precise. "There have been reports of uncleanliness among the house servants. Stand aside." Elijah stepped back, his face carefully blank. He watched as Margaret began opening drawers, rifling through the few possessions he was allowed to keep. A spare shirt, a comb, the books Thomas had given him permission to read. She moved methodically, her hands quick and efficient. When she knelt beside the bed, Elijah's jaw tightened slightly. He knew what was coming. Margaret's fingers found the loose board. She pried it up with practiced ease, as if she'd known exactly where to look. Her hand disappeared into the gap beneath. When she pulled out the small brown bottle, her scream was perfect, high and sharp and full of horror. "Poison!" She staggered backward, clutching the bottle like it might bite her. "You monster! You were going to kill him!" "I never," Elijah began. "Jonas!" Margaret's scream cut through the house like a knife. "Jonas, come quickly!" Footsteps thundered in the hallway. Jonas burst through the door with two other field hands behind him. His face was already twisted with rage, already playing his part. "What is it, ma'am?" Margaret thrust the bottle toward him. "I found this hidden in his room. Poison! He's been planning to murder my husband!" Jonas grabbed Elijah by the arm, his grip brutal and immediate. "You damn fool! You think you could get away with it? I didn't put that there." Elijah's voice was steady despite the fingers digging into his flesh. "Someone planted it." "Liar!" Jonas backhanded him across the face. The sound cracked sharp in the small room. "You've been playing the master for a fool, and now you tried to kill him." Margaret pressed her handkerchief to her mouth, her eyes wide with theatrical shock. "Take him outside. Wake Thomas. He needs to see what his favorite has done." Jonas dragged Elijah toward the door. The other men grabbed his other arm, their faces hard and eager. They hauled him through the house and out into the rain-soaked yard. The whipping post stood near the stables, dark and solid against the storm. Jonas shoved Elijah toward it, while one of the others ran back inside to wake the master. The rain came down harder now, cold and relentless. It soaked through Elijah's clothes in seconds, plastered his hair to his forehead. Jonas tied his wrists to the post with rough hemp rope, pulling the knots tight enough to cut into skin. "Should have known your place," Jonas muttered in his ear. "Should have stayed in the fields where you belonged." Elijah said nothing. He stood with his back to the post, facing the house, waiting. Thomas appeared in the doorway like a ghost, half-dressed and wild-eyed. Margaret was beside him, still clutching the bottle, her face pale with righteous fury. "What is the meaning of this?" Thomas's voice slurred slightly. The rain immediately began soaking through his thin nightshirt. "This!" Margaret thrust the bottle toward him. "I found it hidden in his room. Poison, Thomas. He was planning to kill you." Thomas stared at the bottle, then at Elijah. His face went through several expressions: confusion, disbelief, betrayal, rage. They flickered across his features like shadows. "Elijah." His voice was small, almost pleading. "I didn't put it there, sir." Elijah met his gaze steadily. "I have never wished you harm." "He's lying!" Jonas stepped forward, his hand on the whip coiled at his belt. "The evidence is clear. He's been manipulating you, sir, playing on your kindness, and now he tried to poison you." Margaret moved closer to Thomas, her voice urgent. "You must punish him, publicly. Show everyone that no slave, no matter how favored, can threaten their master and live." Thomas looked between them, Margaret's face tight with vindication, Jonas's hand on the whip, Elijah standing silent and soaked in the rain. "Tie him properly," Thomas said finally, his voice hollow. "Prepare the whip." Jonas grinned. He uncoiled the leather, testing its weight. The other men pulled Elijah's arms higher, stretching him taut against the post. Elijah didn't resist, didn't beg. He simply stood there, water streaming down his face, his expression calm, almost resigned, as if he'd expected this all along, as if some part of him welcomed it. Thomas saw that expression, and something inside him cracked. Some fundamental piece of the foundation he'd built his obsession on suddenly gave way. Jonas raised the whip. The leather sang through the rain. "Enough!" Thomas's shout cut through the storm. The whip fell short, cracking against mud instead of flesh. Jonas froze, arms still raised. Sir? His voice was uncertain. I said enough. Thomas stumbled forward through the rain, his nightshirt plastered to his thin frame. Cut him down! Margaret's face twisted. Thomas, you can't be serious. He tried to. I don't care. Thomas's voice was rising, growing hysterical. Cut him down now! The rain drenched them all, Thomas shaking in his nightclothes, Margaret with her careful hair coming undone, Jonas still holding the whip, Elijah tied to the post with his eyes fixed on the woman who'd tried to destroy him. Their gazes met across the rain-swept yard. Margaret's face was a mask of pure fury. Elijah's was utterly silent, utterly calm. He said nothing. But in that silence was something worse than accusation. Something that promised she hadn't won. Not yet. Not by a long measure. The barn was quiet, except for the rain drumming on the roof. Sarah worked by the light of a single lantern, her hands steady as she pressed a wet cloth against the raw skin where the ropes had cut into Elijah's wrists. He sat on a hay bale, silent. His shirt was still damp from the rain, clinging to his shoulders. The welts on his wrists were angry and red, but they weren't deep. Jonas hadn't had time to do real damage before Thomas stopped him. You should have let them, Sarah whispered. Would have been cleaner. Elijah looked at her. What would? The whip. She wrung out the cloth, pink water dripping between her fingers. Better than whatever's coming next. Nothing's coming next. You believe that? Sarah's voice was sharp. You think she's done? You think he's done? She gestured toward the house, where lamplight still glowed in the windows. They almost killed you tonight, Elijah. And you just stood there like you expected it. I did expect it. Sarah paused, cloth hovering over his wrist. Then why didn't you run? Elijah was quiet for a long moment. Outside, thunder rumbled low across the fields. Because running means they win, he said finally. Running means I accept what they say I am. And what's that? Nothing. His voice was soft but firm. Less than nothing. A thing to be used or destroyed at their pleasure. Sarah finished wrapping his wrists in clean linen torn from an old sheet. Her hands trembled slightly as she tied the knots. You can't fight them, Elijah. No matter how smart you are. No matter how much he wants you. They'll destroy you before they let you be free. I know. Then why? The barn door crashed open. Both of them jumped, turning toward the sound. It was just wind. The door swung on its hinges, banging against the frame. Rain blew in sideways, soaking the straw near the entrance. Sarah stood quickly, moving to shut it. Elijah watched her struggle against the storm, pushing the heavy wood back into place and sliding the bolt home. When she turned back, her face was pale. Get some rest, she said quietly. Tomorrow's going to be worse. She picked up the lantern and left without waiting for a response. Elijah sat alone in the darkness, listening to the rain, feeling the throb of his bruised wrists. In the distance, he could hear voices raised in anger. The main house was still awake, still seething. Margaret swept into the kitchen like a storm herself, her dress rustling furiously. The servants who'd been cleaning up from dinner froze when they saw her face. Out, she snapped. All of you! They scattered immediately, abandoning half-dried plates and soap-slick pans. Only old Bessie, who'd served in the house longer than Margaret had been alive, hesitated. Ma'am, the dishes ain't… I said out! Bessie fled. Margaret stood alone in the kitchen, her hands shaking with rage. She gripped the edge of the table so hard her knuckles went white. Everything she'd built, her reputation, her standing, her marriage, was crumbling because of one slave, one beautiful, cursed man who'd somehow wormed his way into her husband's diseased affections. And Thomas had defended him, even with poison found in his room, even with evidence laid bare. Thomas had stopped the punishment and cut him down like he was something precious, something worth saving. The door opened behind her. Jonas stepped inside, his boots leaving muddy prints on the clean floor. "Well," Margaret didn't turn around. "He's in the barn. Sarah's tending him." "Of course she is." Margaret's laugh was bitter. "They protect each other, these creatures, like rats in a nest." Jonas moved closer, his voice low. "There's only one way to end this, ma'am." Margaret finally turned to look at him. "What do you mean?" "Your husband won't let him be punished, won't let him be sold, won't even let him be whipped." Jonas's scarred face was hard in the lamplight. "So we have to make it look like an accident." "An accident. Fire." Jonas spoke the words simply, like he was discussing the weather. "The carriage house needs repairs anyway. Old wood. Dry despite the rain once you get inside. A lantern tips over. Flames spread fast. These things happen." Margaret stared at him. Her heart was pounding, but not from fear. From something darker, something that felt almost like relief. "When?" she asked. "Tonight. While he's weak. While everyone's asleep." Jonas stepped closer still, his voice urgent. "We lock him inside under pretense of securing supplies. By the time anyone notices the smoke, it'll be too late." Margaret thought of Thomas collapsed in his chamber, drunk and exhausted, thought of the way he'd looked at Elijah in the rain, like losing him would break something fundamental inside, thought of her own humiliation, repeated and compounded with every passing day. "Do it," she said. Thomas lay sprawled across his bed, still in his damp nightshirt. An empty bottle had rolled onto the floor beside him. His breathing was heavy and uneven, caught somewhere between sleep and stupor. He didn't hear the footsteps in the hallway, didn't hear his wife pause outside his door, listening to make sure he wouldn't wake. Margaret moved past without entering. Her face was set, determined. She met Jonas at the back entrance, where he waited with a length of rope and a heavy padlock. They crossed the yard together in silence. The rain had softened to a drizzle, but the ground was still slick with mud. The carriage house stood dark and solid near the stables, its windows shuttered. Jonas knocked on the barn door. "You, Elijah. Master needs the carriage prepared for morning. Get yourself to the carriage house and inventory the supplies." There was a pause. Then the door opened, and Elijah stood there, his wrists still bandaged. He looked at Jonas, then at Margaret standing in the shadows behind him. "Now?" His voice was careful. "You questioning orders." Jonas's hand went to his belt, where he kept a short club. "Move." Elijah moved. They walked through the mud to the carriage house. Jonas unlocked the door and gestured inside. Everything needs counting. Harnesses, buckles, spare wheels. Don't come out until it's done. Elijah stepped inside. The space smelled of leather and oil and old wood. A single high window let in faint moonlight. The door slammed shut behind him. He heard the scrape of metal, the padlock clicking into place. "Jonas?" He moved to the door, testing it. Locked, solid. No answer. Just footsteps moving away. Elijah stood in the darkness, listening. His pulse quickened. Something was wrong. Something beyond simple cruelty. Then he smelled it. Smoke. Sarah couldn't sleep. She lay on her pallet in the women's quarters, staring at the ceiling, thinking about the way Elijah had looked in the barn. So calm. So resigned. Like he'd already accepted his death. She sat up. Something felt wrong. She moved to the window and looked out across the yard. At first, she saw nothing unusual, just darkness and the last traces of rain. Then she saw the orange glow. The carriage house. Smoke was rising from its roof, thick and dark against the night sky. "No!" The word came out as a whisper. Then louder. "No!" She grabbed a shawl and ran. Inside the carriage house, Elijah coughed hard. The smoke was getting thicker, pouring in from somewhere beneath the door. Not an accident, not a tipped lantern. They'd set this deliberately. He moved to the window, but it was too high and too small. He grabbed a harness hanging on the wall, looped it around his bandaged wrists, and used it to pull against the door. The wood groaned, but held. The smoke was filling his lungs now, making his eyes water. He could hear the crackle of flames growing louder. He kicked the door. Once, twice. His shoulder slammed against the wood with all his weight behind it. The third kick cracked something. The fourth sent splinters flying. He fell through into the mud just as Sarah arrived with a bucket, water sloshing over the sides. She dropped it when she saw him. "Elijah!" He crawled forward, coughing violently. The smoke poured out behind him through the broken door. Inside, flames were climbing the walls, spreading fast through the old dry wood. Sarah grabbed his arm, trying to pull him up. "Can you walk?" He nodded, still coughing. Together they stumbled away from the fire, heading toward the darkness beyond the stables. Margaret stood on the veranda, watching the flames grow. Her face was expressionless, carved from marble. Jonas stood beside her, his jaw tight. "It's done," he said quietly. Lightning split the sky overhead, illuminating the burning building in stark white relief. Thunder followed close behind, shaking the ground. Margaret didn't answer. She simply watched the fire consume the carriage house, believing that inside its hungry flames, her problem was finally turning to ash. In the distance, unseen in the darkness of the swamp's edge, Elijah collapsed into the mud. Sarah knelt beside him, her hand on his back, as he coughed up smoke and rain. Dawn broke gray and joyless over Rosefield Plantation. The rain had stopped sometime before sunrise, leaving everything wet and cold. Smoke still rose from the blackened skeleton of the carriage house, thin wisps curling up into the colorless sky like final prayers. Margaret stood on the veranda in a black dress, watching workers pick through the ruins. Her face was composed, almost peaceful. She'd slept well for the first time in weeks. Jonas approached, removing his hat. "Ma'am, we found remains in the corner where the fire burned hottest." It was a lie, of course. They'd found nothing but charred wood and melted metal. But Margaret needed the fiction, and Jonas needed his position. "Bury them," Margaret said, quietly. "No ceremony, and no one speaks his name again in this house. Do you understand?" "Yes, ma'am." "He betrayed us." Her voice was steady, rehearsed. "Tried to burn down the master's property out of spite. The fire took him as justice. That's what anyone who asks will hear." Jonas nodded. He turned to go, then paused. "What about the master?" Margaret's jaw tightened slightly. "What about him? He's been calling for the boy, all night. Barely makes sense half the time." "Then keep him quiet." Margaret turned away, dismissing him. "Give him laudanum if you have to. I won't have this household disrupted any further." Deep in the swamp, where cypress roots twisted through black water and Spanish moss hung like funeral shrouds, Elijah lay on a bed of damp leaves. His breathing was shallow and labored. Burn marks traced angry red lines across his left shoulder and arm, where embers had caught his shirt before he'd torn it off. His face was pale beneath the dirt and ash. Sarah knelt beside him, unwrapping the makeshift bandages she'd fashioned from torn cloth. The burns looked bad, but not fatal. She'd seen worse among the field hands who worked the boiling houses. "Hold still," she whispered, dabbing at the wounds with water she'd carried in a stolen canteen. Elijah flinched, but didn't cry out. He'd learned long ago how to swallow pain. "You need proper medicine," Sarah said. "Honey, at least. Something to keep infection out. Can't risk it." His voice was rough from smoke. "They think I'm dead. Better that way." "For how long?" Sarah's hands trembled as she worked. "You can't stay out here forever. You'll die of fever or worse." "Long enough." Elijah stared up through the canopy, where morning light filtered weak and green. "Until I know what comes next." Sarah had brought food, cornbread and salt pork wrapped in cloth. smuggled from the kitchen before anyone woke. She pressed it into his hands now. Eat. You need strength. He took it, but didn't eat immediately. What's happening at the house? Sarah sat back on her heels, her expression troubled. Everything's falling apart. Half the field hands ran off last night during the confusion. The ones who stayed won't work proper. They're scared. Of what? They're saying the plantation's cursed now, that the fire was a sign, that God's punishing the master for his sins. She lowered her voice even though they were alone. And they ain't wrong. Elijah finally bit into the cornbread. It was dry and tasteless, but his body needed it. Sarah continued, "The neighbors are talking too, saying Margaret's lost control of her household, saying Thomas is mad with fever and grief. Nobody wants to associate with Rosefield anymore." "And Thomas?" Sarah's face softened with something like pity. "He won't stop calling for you. Day and night. Margaret's got him locked in his room, drugged half senseless, but he still calls your name. Over and over." She paused. The fire took everything but his obsession. The words hung between them in the humid air. Somewhere nearby, a heron cried out. A lonely, desolate sound. Elijah chewed slowly, thinking. His burned shoulder throbbed with each breath. His body wanted rest, wanted healing, but his mind was already moving forward, calculating. "How long can you keep bringing supplies without getting caught?" he asked. "Not long. Jonas is watching everyone closer now. Margaret, too. They're suspicious of any slave who moves wrong, or looks wrong, or breathes wrong." Sarah's voice dropped lower. "She wants to make sure you stay buried." "Then I won't stay buried much longer." Sarah looked at him sharply. "What do you mean?" Elijah met her eyes. In the swamp's green shadows, his face looked different, harder, older. I'm going back." "Back?" Sarah's whisper was urgent, almost frightened. "Elijah, they tried to kill you. They'll finish it if they get another chance." "I know." He struggled to sit up, wincing as the movement pulled at his burns. "But Thomas won't rest until he sees me. And Margaret won't rest until she knows I'm truly gone. One way or another, this has to end. You'll die. Maybe." He looked down at his burned arm, at the angry red flesh already starting to blister. "Or maybe I'll finally be free." Sarah wanted to argue, wanted to tell him he was being foolish, that survival was victory enough. But she'd seen that look in his eyes before, the look of a man who'd made his decision and wouldn't be moved. "When?" she asked quietly. "Soon. A few more days to heal enough to move properly." He took another bite of cornbread. "And I'll need one more thing from you." "What?" "A way into the house, after dark, without being seen." Sarah closed her eyes briefly, knowing she was agreeing to something dangerous. But she'd carried his letters north. She'd warned him about Jonas and Margaret's plot. She'd already chosen her side. "There's a back entrance through the root cellar. The lock's been broken for months, but nobody bothered fixing it. Margaret doesn't know, or doesn't care." She opened her eyes again. "But Elijah, what are you planning to do once you're inside?" He didn't answer directly, just stared out at the dark water surrounding them, at the twisted shapes of submerged roots. "What I should have done from the beginning," he said finally. "Take back what's mine." Sarah gathered the empty cloth that had held the food. She stood, preparing to leave before her absence was noticed. "I'll come back tomorrow night," she said, "with more food and medicine if I can get it." Elijah nodded his thanks. She turned to go, then stopped. "They're burying an empty grave today," she said, "with your name on it. Margaret's making a show of it, saying you were a traitor who got what he deserved." "Good." Elijah's voice was flat. "Let them think I'm ash and bones." Sarah left him there, picking her way carefully through the swamp back toward the plantation. As she walked, she could feel her heart pounding, part fear, part something else, something that felt almost like hope. Night fell heavy and complete over Rosefield. Most of the house was dark, the servants having retired early to avoid Margaret's sharp tongue and sharper eyes. The plantation that had once buzzed with forced activity now sat quiet and tense, like something waiting to break. Only one window remained lit, Thomas's bedroom on the second floor. A single lamp flickered there, its light weak and unsteady. From the edge of the swamp, concealed by darkness and distance, Elijah watched that light. He'd made his way carefully through the marsh as the sun set, moving slowly to avoid reopening his wounds. Now he stood at the boundary between wilderness and cultivation, between death and whatever came next. His burned shoulder still hurt with every breath. His body was weak from days without proper food or rest, but his mind was clear, clearer than it had been in years. The lamp in Thomas's window flickered again. Elijah could almost see him up there, fevered and calling out for something he'd never truly understood. Obsession masquerading as affection, ownership dressed up as desire. The manor loomed dark against the darker sky, silent, waiting. Elijah pulled the ragged cloak tighter around his shoulders and watched, just watched. Learning the patterns of the house, the movements of the few remaining servants, the rhythm of the place that had tried to destroy him. Tomorrow night, Sarah would bring final supplies. The night after that, he would return. But tonight, he simply stood in the shadows and stared at that flickering lamp, at the prison that had nearly become his grave. The lock on the root cellar clicked softly. Sarah had been right. It was broken. The mechanism rusted through from years of neglect. Elijah eased the door open just wide enough to slip through, then closed it behind him with barely a sound. The cellar smelled of earth and old potatoes. Darkness pressed thick around him, but he knew these passages. He'd carried wine up these stairs countless times during those weeks when Thomas had kept him close, when Thomas had pretended their arrangement was something other than what it was. His burned shoulder ached as he climbed the narrow steps. The wounds were healing, but still tender, still angry beneath the makeshift bandages Sarah had fashioned. Each breath brought a fresh stab of pain. But pain was familiar now. Pain was almost a comfort. He emerged into the back hallway near the kitchen. The house was silent except for the settling creaks of old wood. Most of the servants had fled or been dismissed. Only a skeleton staff remained, and they kept to their quarters after dark, afraid of Margaret's wrath. Elijah moved through shadows he'd learned to navigate blindfolded, past the dining room where he'd served countless meals, past the parlor where he'd played violin while Thomas watched with hungry eyes, past the study where Thomas had taught him to read, pretending it was generosity rather than possession. The main staircase loomed ahead. He paused at its base, listening. Somewhere above, a floorboard creaked. Then, silence again. He began to climb. The stairs didn't betray him. He'd learned which ones groaned and which stayed quiet, learned to distribute his weight just so. These were skills born of survival, the slave's knowledge of how to move unseen through a master's house. The hallway stretched long and dim, 4 doors on each side, and at the end, the master's chamber. A thin line of lamplight showed beneath that final door. Elijah's hand touched the doorknob. It was cool against his palm. For a moment he stood there, feeling the weight of what came next. Then he turned it slowly and pushed. The room smelled of sickness and laudanum. Heavy curtains blocked the windows except for one, where faint moonlight filtered through. The lamp on the bedside table cast weak, trembling light across Thomas Bellamy's wasted form. Thomas lay propped on pillows, his once handsome face now pale and sunken. His eyes were closed, lips moving in some fevered dream. His hair was damp with sweat. The fine clothes were gone, replaced by a simple nightshirt that hung loose on his frame. "Elijah," he mumbled. "Elijah! Where?" Elijah stepped fully into the room and closed the door behind him. The click made Thomas's eyes flutter open. For a long moment, he simply stared, his expression confused. Then his eyes widened, first with disbelief, then something that might have been joy or terror, or both. "You came back," Thomas whispered. His voice was hoarse, barely audible. "You're alive! They said, Margaret said—" He tried to sit up, but fell back against the pillows, too weak. "She said you were dead. The fire. I thought I'd lost." "You never had me to lose." Elijah's voice was quiet but clear. He moved closer to the bed, his footsteps steady. Thomas reached out one trembling hand. "I thought you were a ghost. I've been seeing you every night, calling for you." His fingers grasped at empty air. "Please, I'm sorry. I never meant—" "You never meant what?" Elijah stopped at the bedside but didn't sit. He looked down at the man who'd owned his body, tried to own his soul. "To keep me? To touch me? To pretend your obsession was something noble?" "I cared for you." Thomas's eyes were wet now. "I gave you everything. Books, music, your own room. I protected you from Jonas, from Margaret. You made me a thing." Elijah's words cut through the fevered pleading. "A beautiful thing you could keep in your house like art or furniture. You dressed me up and called it kindness. You forced yourself on me and called it affection." "No." Thomas shook his head weakly. "No, it wasn't like that. We had something real. I know we did. I felt it. You felt ownership." Elijah knelt then, not in submission, but to bring his eyes level with Thomas's, to make sure the man could see him clearly. "Every time you touched me, I had to choose, endure or die. That's not affection. That's not love. That's just another kind of violence." Thomas's face crumpled. Tears spilled down his hollow cheeks. "I'm sorry. God forgive me, I'm sorry. I didn't understand. I thought—" His breath came in shallow gasps. "I thought if I gave you enough, if I kept you close enough, eventually you'd—" "What? Love you?" Elijah's laugh was bitter. "A slave doesn't love his master, Thomas. A slave survives his master. There's a difference." "Then why did you come back?" The question was desperate, pleading. "If you hate me so much, why are you here?" Elijah studied the ruined man before him. Once, Thomas Bellamy had been powerful, wealthy, educated, handsome. He'd inherited an empire built on suffering and expanded it with casual cruelty. But obsession had hollowed him out. Desire had eaten him from the inside. "Because you need to understand something," Elijah said quietly. "You said you owned me. You believed you had the right to my body, my time, my soul. But here's what you never realized." He leaned closer. Thomas's eyes were fixed on his face with terrible intensity. "You gave me your soul instead," Elijah continued. "Every night you called for me, you gave me more power. Every time you defended me against Margaret, against Jonas, you weakened yourself. Every moment you needed me more than I needed you, the chains reversed." Thomas's mouth opened, but no words came out. "I survived you," Elijah said, "but you couldn't survive wanting me. And that's the difference between us." He stood. Thomas tried to grab his arm but missed, his hand falling uselessly against the bedsheets. "Don't leave," Thomas begged. "Please, don't leave me like this. I'll free you. I'll sign the papers tonight. Just stay. Just—" But Elijah was already moving to the window. He picked up the oil lamp from beside the bed, its flame dancing yellow and warm. Thomas watched him with wide, uncomprehending eyes. "What are you—" Elijah placed the lamp carefully on the wooden window ledge, right where the heavy curtains hung. The flame touched fabric. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the fire caught, a small orange flower blooming against the dark cloth. "No," Thomas whispered. "Elijah." "No!" But Elijah was walking toward the door. He didn't run. He moved with calm purpose, the same way he'd done everything in this house, with the dignity they'd tried to beat out of him and never could. "Elijah!" The scream followed him into the hallway. Behind him, the fire was spreading faster now, climbing the curtains toward the ceiling. Smoke began to curl along the walls. Elijah moved through the hallway with deliberate steps. Behind him, Thomas's screams had dissolved into choking coughs. The smoke was thick now, rolling along the ceiling like a dark river. He descended the main staircase one last time. His hand trailed along the banister he'd polished countless mornings. These walls had witnessed his degradation. Now they would witness his departure. Margaret stood frozen in the front parlor doorway, her face pale in the growing firelight. She wore a silk dressing gown, her hair unpinned and wild. When she saw Elijah, her mouth opened, but no sound emerged. "The Master's calling for you," Elijah said quietly as he passed. "You should go to him." Her eyes darted to the stairs, where smoke billowed thicker with each breath. Then back to Elijah. Understanding dawned slowly across her features. What he'd done, what was happening, what it meant. "You!" The word came out strangled. "You devil! You monster!" Elijah stopped, turned to face her fully. The fire's glow painted them both in shades of orange and shadow. "I'm just a man, Mrs. Bellamy," he said. "Same as I always was. You just never saw it." He walked toward the front door. Behind him, Margaret's shrieks joined her husband's from upstairs. The sound didn't move him. He'd heard worse screams in these fields, screams that went unanswered, unheard, unmourned. The night air hit his face like a blessing, cool and clean after the smoke. He breathed deep, ignoring the pain in his burned chest. Around him, the plantation stretched dark and still, but not empty. They emerged from shadows like ghosts taking solid form. 15 souls, maybe 20. Men and women who'd worked this land their whole lives, who'd bent beneath the whip and risen again, who'd whispered hope in darkness and waited for a sign. Sarah stood at the front, her small frame somehow larger in the firelight. She carried a bundle of supplies, food stolen from the kitchen, tools wrapped in cloth. Her eyes met Elijah's, and she nodded once. Ready. Old Samuel was there too, the man Elijah had replaced. He leaned on a walking stick, but his gaze was steady. Beside him stood Jacob, a field hand with scarred hands and an unbroken spirit. Young Ruth, who worked the gardens. Thomas, who shared a name with the master but nothing else. Marie and her 2 children. Peter, Grace. Names that mattered now. Lives that would be lived, not owned. "The house is burning," Sarah said quietly. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Elijah answered. "And the master?" "Still inside." Someone whispered a prayer. Someone else made a sound that might have been relief or grief or both. No one suggested going back to help. They understood what this moment was, the sharp edge between one life and another. Cutting clean. "The swamp?" Jacob asked. Elijah nodded. "Sarah knows the way. The boats are waiting." They moved as one, a silent procession heading toward the tree line. Behind them, the manor's windows glowed like demon eyes, smoke pouring from the upper floors. A timber crashed somewhere inside, sending sparks spiraling into the night sky. The swamp path was narrow and treacherous. Roots twisted across the ground, ready to catch unwary feet. Spanish moss hung like curtains from cypress branches, brushing their faces as they passed. The air grew thick with moisture and the smell of decay, rich earth and stagnant water. Sarah led them true, never hesitating at the forks and turns. She'd walked this route a dozen times in preparation, memorizing every landmark. Here, a lightning-struck tree. There a cluster of white stones. The moon gave barely enough light to see by, but she needed less. This was the path to freedom, and she knew it like her own heartbeat. The water grew deeper. Soon they were wading through murky shallows, insects buzzing around their heads. A snake slithered past, unbothered by the human traffic. Something larger splashed in the distance. Gator or gar, impossible to tell. Little Marie started to cry, frightened by the darkness and strange sounds. Her mother hushed her gently, murmuring comfort. Elijah moved closer to them, his presence a silent reassurance. They pressed on. Time became strange in the swamp. Minutes stretched like hours. The fire behind them cast a distant glow through the trees, but it grew fainter with each step. Eventually, it disappeared entirely, swallowed by the dense vegetation. Dawn was still hours away when they reached the river's edge. The bank was soft mud and tangled roots, but there, barely visible in the darkness, 3 small boats waited, hidden beneath woven brush. Sarah had done well. Each boat was sound, the oars wrapped in cloth to muffle their sound against the water. Supplies had been tucked beneath the seats, more food, blankets, a few precious tools. They worked quickly and quietly, dividing into groups. The strongest rowers in each boat, the children in the middle, where they'd be safest. Old Samuel settled into the first boat with a soft groan, his old bones grateful for rest. Elijah was the last to board, pushing his boat away from the bank before climbing in. The water was dark as ink, reflecting nothing, but he could feel the current beneath them, steady and sure, pulling them away from Rosefield. They rowed in silence, the only sounds the gentle splash of oars and the night creatures calling from the banks. The river widened gradually, opening up before them like a road. The darkness began to thin at the edges, gray creeping into black. Elijah's arms burned with each stroke, his scarred shoulders screaming protest. But he didn't stop. None of them did. They pulled against the water with desperate strength, putting distance between themselves and everything they'd known. I hope you found that story powerful. Leave a like on the video and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. I have handpicked 2 stories for you that are even more powerful. Have a great day.